Good evening, everybody. For those who don't know, I'm the college president, so it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome everyone to Kellogg College for this second in our series of annual lectures on human rights. So welcome to you all here, and welcome to everyone who's joining us live streamed around the world. My one task, other than welcoming you all, is to introduce Professor Nazila Ghana, who is the university's professor of international human rights law, and is going to introduce a speaker and lead us through the evening's deliberations. So, Naz, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Professor Mickey. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce the speaker and the respondents for tonight. Dr. Joshua Lincoln is our speaker for this second human rights lecture at Kellogg College, and he brings together a really unique blend of skills, experience, research and analysis, both academic and policy-oriented, expertise and insights. It is this uniqueness that likely explains the boldness of the topic he has offered to address tonight at this annual human rights lecture. There are few academics and experts who could even imagine the title of tonight's topic, let alone to be able to address it. Joshua, you have 13 years of UN experience, starting in Nigeria, Cameroon, then peacekeeping missions in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and then in North-South Sudan. And after that, you worked as senior officer in the executive office of the Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, in New York from 2007 to 2011. In fact, he mentioned you at dinner after the first annual human rights talk last spring. This was followed by your work as chef de cabinet to the Director General of UNOG in Geneva, who was also the Secretary General of the Conference on Disarmament, and that was in 2012 to 2013. And then you served as the Secretary General of the Baha'i International Community from 2013 to 2019. As a senior fellow at the Fletcher School of Global Affairs at Tufts University, you are engaged in research, writing, policy, and advisory work, amongst other areas in the Global Governance Forum, the Cambrian Futures Group, and the New Carbon Economy Consortium. We're very grateful that you'll be addressing Towards a Global Plastics Treaty, Emerging Questions of Human Rights and Global Ethics in the Net Zero Transition. The breadth of that topic explains the wonderful respondents that we have, and if you don't mind, I'll introduce them now so that I don't have to interrupt the proceedings later. Professor Myles Allen, we're hugely grateful that you're here tonight. You're widely known as the physicist behind Net Zero. You're the head of atmospheric, oceanic, and planetary physics in the Department of Physics and the professor of geosystem science in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford, unless I've got your bio wrong. You have served on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and were the coordinating lead author on the IPCC special report on the 1.5 degrees centigrade report. As a fellow of the Royal Society and as an awardee of CBE for services to climate change attribution, prediction, and net zero, we're hugely grateful that you will be responding to tonight's topic. I understand that you returned to Oxford after some years working with Bellarive Foundation and UNEP in Kenya and have been awarded the Appleton Medal and Prize from the Institute of Physics. Now, actually, the second respondent also has an Africa connection. Professor Kate, as all of you do, Professor Kate O'Regan is the inaugural director of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at Mansfield College in Oxford and professor of human rights law at the university. You served as a justice on the South African Constitutional Court from 1994 to 2009 as its youngest ever judge, and previously practiced law in Johannesburg, especially in labor law and land law. You have also a rich and vast experience from president of the IMF Administrative Tribunal, president of the Advertising Standards Authority of South Africa, as COVID-19 designated judge for South Africa, and you have worked and do various advisory boards and other roles for Corruption Watch, the Rhodes Trust, and to this day as the trustee of the Oversight Board of Meta. You're also, of course, a wonderful colleague in the Bonavero Institute and the law faculty, and grateful to all three of you for being here. So first, Dr. Joshua Lincoln, if you could start with the talk. We'll have around 35 minutes for the talk. Then each of our respondents, first Professor Allen and then Professor O'Regan, will come, and then we can take some questions. So thank you very much again, and over to you. Thank you.
Excuse us, we're going to do a mic check for a minute. There we go. This okay for the... Okay, lovely. President Jonathan Mickey, Professor Miles Allen, Professor Kate O'Regan, Professor Nazita Ghanea, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Oh, I'm going to move this sideways. So, a real pleasure to be here in Oxford, and a great privilege to deliver this lecture. So I thank you for coming out on such a beautiful evening and coming indoors when you might be elsewhere. I don't take it for granted. It was lovely to see the photo of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon here last year delivering this lecture, and I have big shoes to fill in that respect. I won't ask how the conversation went with him, in what context my name was mentioned. There are a couple possibilities, but we won't explore them here and now. Except to say that part of the reflection process that prompts this lecture begins in the back office of his cabinet in the years leading up to the Copenhagen Summit of 2009 and the years that followed it. And so as one does through an extended period of time, a sort of a thought journey, I felt it important to credit the origin of this thought journey into the cupboards at the back of the cabinet of the Secretary General on the 38th floor, which are the places that we spent most of our time as minions back then. So in thinking about a topic appropriate to the nature of this annual lecture, to the reputation of this university, to the urgency of this particular moment, I wanted to be sure to take on board an issue that would be future-oriented and meaningful to the college's community and to what I understand is its philosophical orientation. And the subject of plastics can strike most people as rather narrow, as technical, even mundane. And honestly, that's the way I started thinking about it. But I hope to show both why this issue is of substantial importance and how it is connected to wider existing challenges of the present moment. Essentially, I'd like to talk about what is happening at the intersection of pollution and climate as separate domains. I will suggest to you that the current negotiations towards the first ever global plastics treaty, a very delicate geopolitical and economic tussle of their own, which I've had the privilege of following for a couple of years now, are bringing to light an interesting set of human rights and ethical issues that are connected to wider themes that were already coming into evidence as the net zero transition gains speed. Therefore, with your permission, I'll situate today's lecture at the intersection of three different moments. Second, I'll briefly draw the contours of the accelerating threat of global plastics before describing the current negotiations. Third, I'll review some key human rights, principles, and ethical issues that seem to arise. And I'll wrap it up by offering brief comment on how these relate to a wider set of issues already in evidence in the net zero transition. Before doing so, I'd like to recognize that Oxford University, through institutions like Kellogg College, the Blavatsky School, the Martin School, through programs like the Net Zero Initiative and the Future of Plastics program, is a leading institution when it comes to a multidisciplinary approach to climate change, earth science, and all things net zero. The situation is much the same in the domain of human rights through the work of the Bonavero Institute and the Human Rights Hub. What I'm trying to say politely is that though I was invited here, I feel a little bit as if I'm entering the lion's den. The lions are friendly, that's good news, but it is a lion's den nonetheless, and best advice under those circumstances is to proceed and to explore the lion's den cautiously and gingerly. And for that reason, I think I would like to propose a reflection that is first and foremost question-oriented, that seeks to ask a set of questions about the moment in which we find ourselves. It tries to bridge disciplines, strands of research, a reflection that might require a bit of discomfort and a bit of humility, because bridging disciplines sometimes requires that. This is, I feel personally, a matter of both style and necessity. I'm certain of very few things based on my short-lived experience, but one of them is that none of today's global problems will be solved by a single professional or epistemological community going it alone. So, to begin, we stand today at the intersection of three different moments, each representing a different process at play at different levels of governance. Governance of the global system as a whole, governance of the environment and the planet, and governance of a specific pollution issue, in this particular case, plastic. The first moment I refer to is the Summit of the Future 7 weeks ago, at that highest level of sort of planetary governance. 79 years after the 1945 San Francisco moment. The immediate context for that gathering is a world-shaking global pandemic, 2 major regional conflicts, a level of geopolitical fragmentation and tension unseen since the end of the Cold War. More broadly, we are living through an uncertain transition to a more multipolar world. From a multilateral perspective, the moment is most interesting because the 4-year preparatory process, roughly from UNGA 75 through UNGA 79, yielded 2 basic observations. The first is there is greater consensus than ever before that the existing multilateral architecture is increasingly fatigued, brittle, and probably unfit for purpose. The second is there's no consensus whatsoever on what comes next. This, the last 5 years, just by way of personal comments, have sort of accelerated that process. People are more willing to have conversations about the fundamental shortcomings of the global architecture today than they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago by any standard. The second moment is COP29, which opened 2 days ago, which refers to this level of sort of environmental governance as a whole. I'll take that COP as indicative of that process as a whole. COP30 in Brazil and the 10th anniversary of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement now loom large 1 year away as points of review and reckoning. UNFCCC discussions this week are centered on the next big post-2025 number, the unspeakable acronym New Collective Quantified Goal, which even by UN standards is a new low. But anyway, it is the goal of climate finance meant to replace the 100 billion annual goal that was set in 2009. The 3 COPs of 2024, what are now called the Rio Trio, climate change, biological diversity, and desertification, remind us that fragmentation and effectiveness remain the twin challenges of environmental governance. Over 500 multilateral agreements, a large number of global and regional institutions, and a proliferation of regulatory regimes and institutions have together created enormous coherence and coordination challenges. The third moment, 2 weeks from now, is the 5th meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, known as the INC in short, seeking to basically conclude an agreement on a global plastics treaty that will meet in Busan starting on the 25th of November. So this brings us to the contours of the global plastics crisis as the immediate subject for today's lecture and the effort to address it. While almost everyone is aware of some part of the plastics problem, usually each of us has I hate to describe this way, but a favorite part of the plastics issue, the one we care the most about. I bet everyone in this room has one. It might be turtles and nets. It might be human health and respiratory disease. It might be rivers. You could pick a piece of this puzzle. But no matter the first piece that you were drawn to, a more systemic understanding of the crisis is really only just emerging. I sometimes think that in comparison to climate change, we're about 20 years behind. We're where climate was in 2005, perhaps, or something like that, in terms of the relationship between policy and science and negotiation and action. I would submit that as an idea for us to keep in mind in terms of the timing of some of these things. A systemic understanding of the crisis only just emerging largely through a synergy of greater research and the negotiations themselves. The very act of calling for the negotiations has led to a spurt of further scientific research that has produced more knowledge, which now feeds into the negotiation process. That process itself, we were talking to someone, a member of the International Law Commission yesterday, who was reflecting on the same phenomena, which is when the International Law Commission takes on an issue in recent years, it prompts further research and thought and elaboration in multiple circles outside, which would come back to enrich the conversation at the International Law Commission, which is then able to begin to set standards and at least to frame issues in interesting ways. We understand far more today about the problem than a few years ago, but the front line of scientific research is still very much in movement. The global plastics crisis is interesting because it has a foot in two of the three components of what is called the triple planetary crisis. It is both a climate problem and a pollution problem. The behavioral challenge is considerable. Plastic is a fundamental material of modern civilization. We increasingly sit, eat, sleep, drive, and live in plastics. The material itself remains critical to fields like medicine, aeronautics, and agriculture. I give the example of the plastic cup, which we all hate, and the Boeing 787, which is the most advanced airplane today, which is 50% plastic laced with carbon. So you have a sense of the extraordinary breadth of this fundamental material and the way in which we use it as a civilization and the problems presented when you try to regulate it or to understand how to differentiate its uses. Both are technically plastic, though obviously they carry very, very different properties and consequences and recyclability and so on and so forth. According to the OECD, annual plastics production was 435 million tons in 2020 and is projected to rise to 736 million tons in 2040. The stock of plastics in rivers and oceans will almost double in that period. By 2060, global plastics consumption, not production, consumption, but obviously related, much of it products with single or short-term uses, and global plastic waste are expected to triple. At the same time, between 6 and 9% only of global plastics is presently recycled. This statistic implies a very simple truth that we cannot recycle our way out of the problem, no matter what is argued. The climate change dimension. Crude oil or gas is currently the feedstock for 99% of primary plastics. Plastics production in 2019 accounted for 5.3% of total global emissions. By 2050, it is expected to consume 21% of the remaining global carbon budget, the emissions that would keep us below 1.5 degrees. Two small words are critical in last year's COP28 UAE consensus. You might have missed them. The transitioning away from fossil fuels was explicitly tied in the outcome document to, quote, energy systems, end quote. The negotiations for a plastic treaty confirmed that there is no such consensus on transitioning away from fossil fuels in areas other than energy, i.e. materials. To do so, obviously, would cut further into the oil and gas profits of petrochemical companies. These profits feed the fiscal coffers of oil and gas producing countries in both the developing and the developed world. Many countries have in recent years made major infrastructural investments to stand up new petrochemical industries, and such investments take decades to amortize. The pollution dimension is perhaps more severe. An estimated 4,200 chemicals harmful to human and environmental health are currently used in plastics manufacturing. Every study that comes out that tries to assess this number usually comes up with a slightly bigger number. It's been climbing sort of for the last couple of years. Evidence continues to mount of the presence of plastic particles, not just on land, in rivers and oceans and in the air, but also in animals and in human tissue, lungs, blood, and placenta. The disease burden and cost due to chemicals used in plastic materials is also growing. For example, one study estimated the U.S. burden in 2018 at roughly $249 billion. That's 1.2% of the GDP. This is an important point. Plastics are cheap only to those who make and sell them, but who pay none of their staggering costs. According to a 2023 World Wildlife Fund study, a kilo of plastic costs roughly $1 to produce globally as an average. But its lifetime cost to human health, the environment, and end-of-life cleanup total $19 for higher income countries and $150 to $200 for low and middle income countries. It's a staggering difference. The implication is interesting, though. Environmentalist or not, beyond the damage to human and environmental health, plastic is deeply detrimental to national development itself. Against that background, in 2022, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, UNEA, mandated negotiations towards a treaty on plastic pollution based on the full life cycle approach. These become very important words in the negotiations. The discussions since have seen the emergence of two opposing coalitions: a high ambition coalition of over 60 states co-chaired by Norway and Rwanda, comprising those nations that bear the disproportionate brunt of plastic pollution, including islands, landlocked countries, and low and middle income economies, and a smaller group of like-minded states, as they self-describe themselves, comprising leading oil and plastics producers. Today's lecture is focused on the human rights aspect. I'm glad to talk more about the geopolitics and the Q&A if you would like, but I'm going to stick to the human rights lane for now. It's also safer ground for initial remarks. To be most effective, a treaty would need to address one critical upstream issue, three difficult midstream issues, and one thorny implementation challenge. I should clarify that the nomenclature upstream, midstream, and downstream refers upstream to the production of primary plastic, the material. Midstream is when you turn it into products. You add additional additives and chemicals in that process as well. Those are then put into use. They may have some recycling or reusability to them, but ultimately the downstream part of their life cycle is what you do with them at the end of their useful life. Sometimes in circular systems that work, you can recycle them up to the midstream and back down. But in the case, as I said, 9% recycling for the system as a whole, that is actually a very minor part of the overall process at present. So the big upstream issue is a curb on the production of primary plastic polymers. No surprise. Highly contested, most difficult. The midstream issues are, first, a regulation of the hazardous chemicals used in making plastics and plastic products, the 4,200 chemicals that I referred to as a possibility. To give you a scale of the problem, the BSR, the Basel, Stockholm, Rotterdam conventions that regulate a set of chemicals that are not used in plastics, the total number of chemicals they seek to regulate is 130. We are talking about 4,000 plus. The second midstream issue is a ban or phase down of problematic or avoidable plastic products. Separate from the chemicals, we look at the plastic products, the grand variety of them, and decide which are basically harmful to the environment or unnecessary. These issues, the ones I've listed so far, position oil and petrochemical states and companies against the rest. The third midstream issue is new product design and industrial standards to promote greater circularity. These things are happening as we see them. I think recently here in Europe and the UK, you have bottles that are now attached, the caps are attached to the bottles. That is a year old or less. That is an example of the evolution of product design and industrial requirements. The next step, for example, would be to make those caps, for example, to require them to be bioplastic, or plastic that would be made from a feedstock other than oil or something that you could evolve. You will continue to see that as a consumer. Soon, we're no longer going to use plastic bottles. We're going to take glass bottles back to the shop and get them refilled with whatever the drink of choice was through machines that Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whoever it is will actually put in place to carry out that process. Another example might be the reversal of the whole trend towards liquefied soaps. 25 years of liquefied soaps might start moving the other way. We would go back to bars and to even shampoo bars, which you can find. These are the examples of industrial eco-design, industrial standards changing in order to redirect consumer markets in more sustainable ways. The third mainstream, I dealt with that one. Finally, on implementation, the question of a financing mechanism is critical for the next generation of recycling infrastructure in particular. One of the reasons why there's such a discrepancy in the number and the cost of plastic for developing economies and developed economies is because many developing economies lack recycling infrastructure, and that would need to be built up, and that in turn requires financing. This issue broadly pits the global north against the global south in ways that are reminiscent of the climate negotiations on financing. The Plastics Treaty has also, to be fair, suffered from a bad case of poor timing. Beyond the previously mentioned COP28 outcome that brought a lot of attention, it was a great victory in of itself to be able to finally get agreement on the phase out of the use of fossil fuels for the purposes of energy, but it has, let's say, made member states and oil producers far more cautious with respect to giving away that right on materials. The second reason is that there are over 48 national elections in 2024, and national elections are never good for national negotiators. They tend to be more squeamish and a little uncertain. I can speak from experience post-November 5. We have a bit of a question mark on the uncertainty of the negotiations and the negotiating position of certain member states going forward. The outcome of where the negotiations stand, very briefly, the draft agreement coming out of the last round still has some 3,600 negotiating brackets to it, which is essentially makes it impossible. Thankfully, the chair of the negotiations, Ambassador Luis Vallas, a couple of weeks ago proposed a chairman's draft, which is a highly streamlined sort of 18-page version of the previous 75-page agreement that he's proposing be the basis for the final round of negotiations. I can just observe that absent that text, we don't have much of a chance at an outcome. So the chairman's text is a very good idea. Let me move on to the key human rights principles and ethical issues in question. And I will go through these a little bit quickly. We could come back to them. We could find expertise in the room that could speak to them in greater detail. But I think it's important maybe to review them and to think about them because they provide an interesting basis. For myself, it was an interesting opportunity to go back and to try and identify them a little more systematically. Marcos Orellana, the Special Rapporteur for Hazardous Substances and Wastes, and David Boyd, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, both colleagues of Professor Lanez, addressed a set of comments to the INC in April 2024. Overall, they noted that the whole cycle of plastics at its various stages has become a global threat to human rights. Human rights principles are thus critical to legitimate, equitable, and effective responses. These 2024 comments drew on an earlier report done by Mr. Orellana to the General Assembly in 2021, where he reviewed the implications of the plastics life cycle for human rights. We'll touch on a couple of those issues. The first right is, of course, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. But this right is, in fact, very recent, legally speaking, or formally speaking. It was only formally recognized by the United Nations Human Rights Council in October 2021. It's not one of those 1948 rights that was in the Universal Declaration. The environment didn't exist as a concept. It didn't exist enough to become the fifth pillar of the United Nations, which is what it would be today, along with the first four pillars. If we were to tweak the system today, the very first thing we would all do is add environment and the planet in as the fifth pillar of the system as a whole. And the right was also recognized by the United Nations General Assembly in a resolution in July 2022. The UNEA resolution of 2 March 22 makes no reference to human rights. This is the one that authorizes the start of negotiations. Even though it makes no reference to human rights, much less to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, even though that right was formalized by the General Assembly a mere 5 months earlier. A couple of references to human rights have been made in various outlines and early drafts so far, but mainly they remain in the preamble section, which is where these things tend to be placed these days. Still, the Plastics Treaty negotiation is quite interesting because it is the first, or one of the very first, such processes since the formal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It's also interesting because the substance of the right itself is so directly relevant to aspects of the plastic crisis. Moving on, more widely, Principle 10 of the 1992 Rio Declaration sets out 3 fundamental access rights, as they're known, that are also relevant in the plastic context. The right to information, in this case on the hazards of plastics, the right to science to ensure the best available scientific evidence, and the right to meaningful participation in decision-making, in this case, the public's right in plastic policymaking. A related right is the right to access to justice, which implies that the public should be capable of triggering action to support and monitor compliance with the treaty and that there is access to effective remedy. Some of these rights implicate broader ethical principles. The right to information implicates the transparency principle, including disclosures on toxic additives, on production levels, chemicals added to plastics, and chemicals released from plastics. The prevention and precautionary principles are relevant with respect to the risks and harms from plastics. Prevention requires reducing production of plastics and avoiding toxic additives and chemicals of concern. The precaution principle applies where there are gaps in knowledge or uncertainties to the effects of plastics. Such gaps should not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures where there is a risk of a serious or irreversible harm. The polluter pays principle, which is a favorite in this respect, seeks to make global plastic producers, traders, and other businesses that profit from plastics responsible for the externalized costs of the entire cycle of plastics. Mechanisms can take the form of EPR, what are known as EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility Schemes, which already exist in certain national jurisdictions. Finally, the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities Principle, known as CBDR, or Principle 7 of the Rio Convention, asserts a global responsibility for environmental protection, but differentiates that responsibility according to the scope of contribution to the problem and the resources needed to redress the impacts. In its work, the UNFCCC adds to this an additional element, the respective capabilities of states. So a global responsibility for environmental protection, but then a differentiated responsibility with respect to how to meet the burden of that effort. Uniquely, the plastic crisis offers a vivid and unfortunate illustration of several specific social justice issues with just transition implications. Vulnerable populations take multiple forms. In the context of the plastic crisis, primary plastic and plastic products are rarely produced in the same place they are consumed or ultimately disposed of. Small island states, in particular, rarely have petrochemical industries, but routinely suffer a paralyzing impact on their marine environments and fisheries. In the case of plastics, some 20 million waste pictures are another important community of concern, whose health can be affected by the mechanical recycling they carry out, but whose livelihoods also depend on this work. At each stage of the life cycle of plastics, borderline, or what are known as frontline communities, disproportionately suffer pollution effects. The United States has a cancer alley in Louisiana, while Canada has a chemical valley in Sarnia, Ontario. In the Cancer Valley I just mentioned in Sarnia, an indigenous community, the Amjiwanag First Nation, declared a state of emergency literally during the last round of negotiations that were happening in Ottawa, after levels of both a known carcinogen and high benzene spiked, which led to the temporary shutdown of a local plastics plant. In his 2024 report to the General Assembly, Mr. Orellana looked at vulnerable populations suffering disproportionate impacts, specifically due to their sex or gender. Overall, the report finds that a planetary chemical crisis of unprecedented proportions is inflicting harm to countless individuals and communities, causing and deepening injustices in who can live healthy lives, reproduce, and have healthy newborns, and who cannot. Let me quote this further. There is an alarming and growing body of science on how both legacy and modern chemicals are damaging people in gendered and sexed ways. Activists, public health officials, and scientists have been ringing alarm bells about potential and known harms from hazardous substances, including those recently found in testes, sperm, newborns, placentas, blood, and breast milk. Hazardous chemicals threaten human reproduction. The sexed and gendered process of creating and sustaining new humans is dependent on the right to a toxic-free environment, which is part of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Chemicals are linked to male and female subfertility and infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, adverse birth outcomes, neurological and multi-system impacts on children, cancer, and disability. The fact that the plastic crisis is damaging people in gendered and sexed ways raises one final issue today: intergenerational equity and the rights of future generations. This seems to be possible in at least three different ways. First, as just noted, toxic additives or chemicals in plastics can essentially directly disrupt human procreation itself. Second, even if life is not threatened, the health of future generations may well be. Once a chemical enters the body, it increases the risk of the chemical also affecting future generations. The exposure of pregnant women to such hazardous substances can also affect the health of their descendants. Third, even if health were not threatened, the future detoxification of the planet is a separate risk. The existing global plastics crisis is, quote, aggravating the toxification of the planet and undermining the ability of future generations to enjoy their human rights and an environmentally conducive environmentally conducive to a life with dignity. Growing volumes of public waste impose a debt on future generations. It is important, perhaps, to note that these harms accumulate at greater rates in marginalized communities, potentially deepening inequity and injustice between groups over time and generations. So that was the sober part of the talk, or at least it should be. For the final section now, I would just like to circle back and sort of widen the lens and come back out to the net zero transition and to some of the issues that are perhaps similar or connected between these two sets, between these two areas. To do so, we have to ask, or at least I will ask, where the net zero transition is at. And we're at Oxford, so the Oxford Net Zero Initiative could tell us very easily, in this case, the net zero track, which is produced here. Basically, their most recent report from 2 months ago, I think, finds a world, quote, on the path to net zero, but in dire need of swift, sustained action to turn targets into concrete, credible implementation plans, end quote. I will spare you the numbers of how many countries, companies, regions, etc. But those numbers are positive, but there is a sort of significant effort in terms of turning those initial pledges into policy, into law, into policy, into strategies that can actually be implemented. There's a concern about the integrity of many of those pledges and many of those policies. They don't meet that high standard. The number of countries that are adopting net zero plans is leveled off because most countries by now, 148, have them. But we are still seeing important growth in the number of countries in particular converting those pledges into policy. And that is perhaps the positive part of the story. If Net Zero Tracker gives us a snapshot of the transition from the perspective of the starting line, another report, this one by the McKinsey Global Institute, does the same from the perspective of the finish line. In their eyes, they find that we are 10% of the way to net zero, with 90% to go. And what they describe, quote, as an eye-wateringly vast, complex, and interlinked energy transition, end quote, that will involve about 60,000 power plants, 1 billion vehicles, and many billion tons of materials over that period of time. To get from here to there, then, is the big question for us, certainly from a net zero perspective, from a decarbonization perspective. And I think I would like to peg my two final thoughts to that frame. To get from here to there is, bluntly speaking, first and foremost, a matter of finance, of money, which is simultaneously the backbone and the battleground of the net zero transition. Without it, it's not possible, and therefore it is the thing that is most highly contested. In 2009, as many of you know, developed countries agreed to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020. This was extended to 2025 later in climate finance to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to climate change. The OECD reported a few months ago that developed countries met and exceeded that annual goal for the first time in 2022. They met it, I believe they raised $116 billion that year. UNFCCC discussions at COP29 this week are centered on the next big post-2025 climate number. To give you some sense of scale, UNCTAD finds the goal should be based on the evidenced needs of developing countries, uphold the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, our old friend, and respective capabilities, which is what the UNFCCC adds on, and support just transition pathways. They estimate that developing countries require around 1.1 trillion annually for climate finance from 2025, rising to 1.8 trillion from 2030. Those numbers are big numbers. very big numbers, except for comparison purposes, that target would represent 1.4% of developed countries' GDP. Military expenditures in 2023, by comparison, were 1.9%, and total fossil fuel subsidies in 2022 were 3.6%. So the money is there. It's being used for other things. On the plastics side, the Nordic Council of Ministers recently estimated that addressing the plastics crisis effectively from 25 to 2040, they have various scenarios, and their sort of effective management scenario is the one I'm referring to, would require $1.5 trillion of public finance over that 15-year period. So just, if you're as bad at maths as I am, 1 year of climate finance, of the new climate finance target, would be enough, of roughly, give or take, a couple hundred million, a couple hundred billion, to deal with the plastics crisis over a 15-year period. So I think the insight there is that the numbers are of a different order of magnitude to solve climate change or to solve decarbonization and plastics, while still being absolutely significant and feeling prohibitive to anybody who has to run a household or a government in that sense. But the global conversation about apportioning the burden to meet the increasingly urgent needs on both climate change and the plastics and plastics pollution will only grow. I think one of the things we've learned from the climate change domain, which we can anticipate in the plastics domain, is the conversation, as the need does not go away, regardless of what is agreed to in Busan, for example. Let's say there were no agreement in Busan. The plastics crisis is not going away the same way that the decarbonization crisis is not going away, which means that failure to resolve the problem effectively now simply ensures that we'll have to come back the year after next. And I think that's an important, I'm hoping that that is something that all the negotiators from all sides are internalizing, which is the lesson of the Paris Agreement, the lesson of Copenhagen to Paris plus 10 and all the rest of it, is that you might feel like you want to delay substantive negotiations of a thing, but it's not necessarily to your advantage either, because the thing keeps coming. And we are in that position on climate change, and I would submit to you that we are in that position on plastics. I will finish with a thought on recentering human rights in the climate and pollution domains. The climate crisis famously endangers enjoyment of the rights to life, health, water, and sanitation, food, housing, self-determination, education, and the access rights to seek justice and remedy. But the net zero transition will also carry new specific concerns. For example, the mining sector has long given rise to human rights violations. I've argued elsewhere that given the expected 400 to 600% growth in demand for transition minerals in the decades ahead, an increase in this category of concerns and violations can be expected. Through the 2022 GA resolution on the right to a clean, the 2022 GA resolution on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was non-binding, its principles have been enshrined in more than 150 national jurisdictions. There's been a growing national level legal action towards recognizing climate obligations. It was in the news yesterday, a Shell appeal that was, what's the right word? That was recognized, that was accepted by the court, and we now have even a trickle of cases at regional and continental levels. But the operationalization of the right is far from complete, especially in intergovernmental processes. And this is perhaps what I wanted to draw your attention to. In a range of fora, governments have resisted or sidestepped the inclusion of explicit references to this right or to others. The 2015 Paris Agreement included some human rights language, for example, but only in one preambular paragraph, which states that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. So for your standard international lawyer or negotiator or lawyer negotiating, you recognize weak language when you hear it. There is not the word shall, and that's the word that we're missing in this respect here. Should consider would be the bottom of the performance that is anticipated by this. But you may wish to consider your obligations as you carry forward on this. That would be how I would understand it, and I think that's how most people intended it. This is a rather weak formulation of state obligation within the climate change negotiations. By comparison, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time found that state failure to take action to prevent human rights harms caused by climate change effectively constituted a breach of obligation. So it was their view that said, if you don't meet that moment, you are in violation of your existing obligations. And so you see the two different approaches that happen. This is a prominent illustration of a wider pattern. 30 years of climate negotiations have historically taken a technocratic, a kind of a combination of political and pragmatic and technical posture, i.e. that complex environmental problems can and should be dealt with like political ones, through the framework of political compromise. From there flows a priority on mitigation, then adaptation, and only then on loss and damage. The focus is on managing risk and doing so in a fundamentally economic way, driven by the national priorities of those states who are already prominent actors in the global economic order. I think it would be fair to say, in conclusion, that the technocratic approach to environmental concerns has yet to fully bear fruit. Perhaps we could begin to address the gap by framing more prominently both climate change and the plastics crises as human rights issues, and by being far more explicit in negotiated texts about the obligations of signatories to various human rights treaties to respect, promote, and fulfill those rights. Thank you very much.
Wow, well, that's quite a lecture to respond to. So you've given me quite a challenge here, but it's a fascinating topic. So I'm really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me to sort of join. And I hope, to be honest, this was an invitation to me to think about plastic for the first time. So I'm new to this, but the analogies between the plastic issue and the global climate challenge are fascinating. And one of my preoccupations, as those who know me in the room know, that I've been worrying about, and perhaps taking a rather different approach to where you ended in your lecture, about whether the issue with the way we approach the climate issue is sort of maybe not technocratic enough, rather than is there a way of framing the climate issue in a way that we have successfully addressed other environmental issues that would allow us to perhaps make more progress than we're making at the moment? And so imagine a world in which we've solved the climate issue, and since we've stopped climate change getting any worse. What does that world need to look like? And certainly, if we look at all of the scenarios for in which we do actually manage to solve climate change at some point this century, so it's not a world where we've solved climate change by just all going extinct, which would work, but I mean it's just not a desirable way of doing it. We are probably still using fossil fuels in that world. So if we stop climate change this century, which is what we need to do if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need to stop it before we actually manage to stop using fossil fuels, because that's the momentum behind our use of fossil fuels is such that we don't have time to solve climate change by just phasing them out altogether. And that means that in that world, a ton of carbon dioxide is being safely disposed of permanently for every ton still generated by any remaining use of fossil fuels. To my mind, the only way that could happen without a very draconian global government sort of monitoring every action of lots of people, or the expenditure of a vast amount of taxpayers' money, I guess the other option is that you actually, and you mentioned this idea of producer obligations in your lecture, is that the people bringing fossil carbon into the climate system have an obligation to take it back out again as well. So, if you apply the principle of producer responsibility to fossil carbon, and what was the sort of real eye-opening moment for me that this might even be possible was when I gave a talk to the young engineers of one of the world's large oil and gas companies in the year after we released the 1.5 degrees report. My talk was the sort of standard 1.5 degrees report. I think they sort of invited in a climate scientist, to entertain the troops, so to speak. Inevitably, at the end of my talk, one of the senior management asked, "Are you serious? Do you think there's any chance of us actually limiting warming to 1.5 degrees?" And I just responded to the room, well, if you had to get rid of a ton of CO2 for every ton generated by the products you sell and the process of making them, by 2050, would you be able to do so? And the young engineers just responded like I'd insulted them. Of course they would. And I wonder whether that question has been asked of the plastics industry. If the plastics industry were required to take a ton of polymer, whatever the polymer was that they were, and I'm thinking about the right upstream plastics industry, the Aramcos of this world, for whom this is a sort of big part of if they were obligated to take a ton of a polymer out of the system for every ton they sell, would they be able to do so? I wonder if that question's been asked. And what would the world look like in which that was an obligation on the producers? Because, as I say, I can't see any other way of fixing this. If you did do that, because you mentioned that an eye-watering amount of public finance that people have worked out that would be required to deal with this, that's hard. Public finance is difficult to raise. This obligation, this hypothetical obligation I'm talking about, wouldn't cost a penny to the public purse. It's just, it would make plastic more expensive. Okay, but that's probably not too much of a problem. So can we imagine a world? So I said my long-winded question to you is that a thing? Are people even thinking of that possibility? What would happen to me if I suggested such a thing in Saudi Arabia? Anyway, that's sort of maybe the last question. But I mean, I mentioned that simply because I was in Saudi Arabia recently talking about the idea of an obligation to recover CO2 as a condition of selling, and actually they were totally open to that idea. I mean, because they recognised that their abilities to get rid of CO2 are also extremely good, as well as their ability to generate the stuff that produces it. How would they react? I think it's interesting. How would these producer countries, who I gather are at the moment quite hesitant about a global plastics treaty, how would they react to this sort of principle going forward? That's my long-winded question to you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Joshua, for a really fascinating lecture in which I learned a huge amount. And I'm just going to respond to your provocation, I think, which is that we might be able to move the debate forward if we use human rights as the way of kind of framing how we think not only about climate change and the move to net zero, but also plastic pollution and a range of other global challenges. And it seems to me that there is something very attractive about the idea of we all have an entitlement to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. It seems intuitively correct, and for most people it seems a very attractive idea. But there are challenges, of course, with this. And the first challenge, I think, is that we are living at a time of, as you mentioned at the outset, of real geopolitical division. We're increasingly seeing the idea of mobilizing around one common set of values or one common perception of the way the world is as very difficult. Not only are nation states polarized, but globally we're polarized. And so getting that to actually have any weight in the kind of conversations you're talking about that are going to be happening towards the end of this month on the Plastic Convention is probably one of the hardest things to be doing. On the other hand, in rebuttal of that, in a sense, is the fact that throughout the history of the international human rights law movement, geopolitics has quite often been pretty difficult. So if you look back to the foundation, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which was a declaration of human rights adopted by the General Assembly, with the vast majority of states who were then members of the General Assembly supporting it. But it was a non-binding convention. It was really a declaration of rights that didn't impose obligations upon the states. And it was always intended to lead to a series of international obligations, a series of treaties or covenants between international states which would impose obligations. But no sooner, in a sense, was the ink dry on the Universal Declaration. You only have to look at the political events of 1948. Then we moved into the period of the Cold War. And getting those rights recognized as obligations that states would undertake seemed for almost 15 years to be absolutely impossible, because really neither the West or the global North nor the Soviet Union and its satellites had any interest in actually getting these declaration of rights into binding state obligations. But then, somewhat surprisingly, in a sense, in the aftermath of decolonization in the 1960s, a surprising new impetus arose, probably not enormously predicted, and in fact, we ended up with these big covenants of the 1960s, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, all adopted in the 1960s. And all of them are now basically signed up to by a very, very high proportion of the world states. It seemed very impossible. And so I don't think we should give up just because geopolitics looks hard. There are possibilities. There are ways of getting things done. So that's to sort of rebut my first concern about geopolitics. The second concern I have is that turning away from geopolitics for a moment to ordinary politics in countries around the world, we're seeing a polarization around questions that you could loosely describe as human rights. You can see that in quite a lot of the political contestation in your country, in the elections we've just seen, but here in the United Kingdom, in South Africa, from where I'm from, one is seeing an emergence of a politics which is deeply skeptical of human rights and often, in fact, mobilizes around a hostility to the very idea of rights. You've seen that in the United Kingdom, debates about whether the United Kingdom should continue to be a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. And in some ways, I think this is a bigger risk than the geopolitics, because, as I've said, I think geopolitics shifts and it is surprising how alliances form. But if ordinary people lose faith in the project of human rights, if ordinary people don't believe that this is actually how we should conceive of the world, then using human rights, as you suggest, to actually get us to be thinking about problems like climate change, like plastic pollution, in human rights language, is very difficult. And yet I'm going to suggest there that there's a rebuttal too. One of the things I found very interesting during COVID was how across the world, people who had generally not thought about a problem like a major global health crisis in human rights terms, very quickly grasped the relatively simple proposition that everybody should have access to vaccines. You saw that attitude of ordinary human beings in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, whether you were talking about China, whether you were talking about South Africa, whether you were talking about the United Kingdom, the idea that everybody had a fundamental right to be treated equally in relation to healthcare during COVID was sort of an instinctive, intuitive human rights response to the problem. So although I do see this polarization emerging, I do also think that there is a real prospect that people will see that there's something deeply intuitively, morally correct about the idea that we should all have access to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And so it seems to me that there is something important in your provocation, that if we're in the language of money and we're in the language of sort of technocratic negotiation around how the science works, and we don't try to communicate the fundamental principle that ordinary people, this generation and the generations to come, do have rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And that right is not something that is self-enforcing, immediately stated, but something for mobilization, for recognition. Then it seems to me that there is a real value to be had from a human rights discourse. It's less a legal value, less the idea that you can enforce these rights, but more that ordinary people will claim them and recognize the legitimacy of claiming them, which might well move the debates forward. Thank you.
Would you like me to? All right. Now for the difficult part. Thank you. That was lovely and really immediately sort of into the more thorny aspects of this. And for that, I thank you both. And I very much did mean it a bit as a provocation and as a way of encouraging a conversation, because as I said at the outset, I don't personally think anybody's going to solve this sitting in their corner alone. That's my impression. And so this idea of how to mobilize more than one community, more than one perspective, more than one, to bring all forces to bear. It seems to me we're running out of time for an alternative. Let me put it that way. I'll try and just piece together a couple thoughts on the two questions or the two responses. Then maybe we can open it up for questions if we have time. I think the technocratic point is a very good one. I don't mean to go down this human rights road and leave behind the tech. I mean to reinforce the focus on the technocratic by calling on the human rights very much in the way that you've suggested, which is it is more at a foundational level than at the expectation that it's going to carry legal weight. I think we all know the difficult history of that. The expectation that human rights, when put into treaties, will carry legal weight and effective weight over time is a proposition that is subject to questioning, although courts can and do over time bring to bear force to that. And so that is the second reason to put them in. But the first is undoubtedly, I would say, aspirational or foundational more than it is legal in terms of the logic of it. I haven't asked Aramco. I would love to ask Aramco. If you get a chance, please do on my behalf. If I run into them, I will ask. I think it is an important question. My suspicion is that if we were to ask Aramco, we were picking on Aramco, if we were to ask any plastics producer this question 20 years from today, they would be much more, or a country that is a plastics producer 20 years from today, they would be much more amenable to it for having survived the net zero transition and the loss of fiscal income. That's what one of the things I meant with respect to bad timing. From what I understand, a number of consulting companies may have suggested to oil-producing countries in the last 10 years to build up petrochemical industries in order to make up for their lost revenue that they were going to lose on the energy side. So that many of these oil producers are planning for 50% of their future profits not to come out of the energy side, but to come out of the material side. And hence the bad timing, which is to come around now and put that side of the income sheet into question is unpalatable from the get-go in some respects. I say that because I think if we brought the engineers in, and I have spoken to some of those, they would find a solution fairly quickly. It might not look the way it does on the carbon side because we have a problem with the proliferation of a huge amount of unnecessary plastic. So the narrowing down of plastic productions is inevitable. There is no way to continue to produce plastics at that rate and in that volume if we wish to be able to swim in rivers and oceans and seas and to have some quality of life. But there is a huge number of issues and emerging sort of technologies and a whole set of questions that have yet to be fully answered, and technologies that are potentially in the making. Which I give an example. There are startups that are working on bioplastics that use agricultural waste as a feedstock instead of oil, and I believe they're able to produce essentially the same chemistry, chemical PET, the same plastic at the other end, by using corn husks and banana leaves as the feedstock instead of oil. that doesn't solve the problem of chemicals and what you need to additives and all the rest of it. But the engineers are always up for the challenge in my experience. And so there's certainly hope in that direction, but it won't get us away from the problem of volume and single use and the sort of the wasteful aspect of the plastic crisis that becomes associated with single use and problematic plastics. So it's a sort of a yes and no in that sense. I very much see the solutions on the technocratic side, on the technology side coming, but I like to see them given greater impetus through what I think is this use of returning to the basic idea of the human rights that relate to these issues in that sense. And from that perspective, I would say I believe I've been wondering in recent weeks whether the fact that there's more and more research. I asked a scientist from Woods Hole in the United States what the science agenda was on the research side for the next 10 years on plastics, and two issues came forward: the marine environment. We need continued research on that. That is going to take at least another 10 years to sort of improve the level of scientific understanding, and human health. And I wonder whether human health is not the one that tips it ultimately, because it is more identifiable as a direct impact, personally held human right, and is something that can be more easily grasped by a greater number, unfortunately, than can animal health or planetary health in some respects. So as the problem can't go away, it is not going away. The awareness is rising. Public opinions are changing and evolving. Maybe the sensitivity of governments over time will decrease as they get over the anxiety of trying to survive the net zero transition, a very real prospect for many governments around the world. I mean, there are those that have enormous wealth funds, and then there are those that have economies that are entirely dependent on oil and that have not diversified their economies. And for them, they're really looking at a fundamental question about their ability to survive the transition. So that would be my initial set of responses to that in a combined fashion.
Thank you. I wonder if we can take 3 very short comments and get you to respond. I think otherwise we're definitely out of time. Anybody want to take the challenge? There are 2 people with mics who will kindly come to you. We have one here. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you. My name's John Hind. I worked in the plastics industry for 40 years. I've been worrying about plastic pollution for half that time. I had never considered the human rights aspect of that. So thank you very much for explaining where that fits in. The other comment I'd like to make is about the challenge to engineers to get the plastic out of the environment. In a sense, it's easy to get the carbon dioxide out because you don't have to go looking for it. Right. Plastics, first of all, you've got to find it. And if you go on Dartmoor now and you throw a bottle out of your car window, in 20 years it'll be in the sea. And it'll be broken up into bits. And there's a huge amount of plastic in the ocean. There's a wonderful outfit called Ocean Cleanup. Google it. It's a young man who didn't realize what the old greybeards knew, that it was going to be impossible to get it out in the environment, so he went and did it anyway. And I think they've only pulled out 500 or 1,000 tons so far from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And that has been recycled, and the idea is that will fund the future project. The only big hitter behind it is Coca-Cola, who is funding them, because Coca-Cola feels a responsibility for the bottles that are going into the sea. And the other thing he's done, apart from scooping it up out of the Pacific, is to put barriers on the 1,000, or his aim is to do the 1,000 most polluting rivers in the world, which have been identified. So that's how that's, if you like, an engineer's answer to that question.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? The gentleman behind you.
Hi, yes. I think a term was coming to me in what Miles was saying, and I think I've got the name of the other speaker, and was looking for a simple proposition, and the simple proposition was polluter pays, which was obviously underlying what was being said there, and is such a simple mantra, but I'm not sure whether it was around in 1948. It wasn't. Thank you very much. That was my comment.
Thank you. Anybody else? Otherwise, Dr. Lincoln?
Thank you. I realize the hour's late, and I apologize, and you've been very kind and patient with me. Just very briefly, thank you for the insider view from the plastics engineering corner, which is an important one to include. And I absolutely agree. I think that the significant amount of the cost associated with cleaning up plastic is finding it and then figuring out what to do with it. And there are associated problems of leaching and so on that one comes up against. We don't have time to go into them. But one of the fascinating aspects of this particular issue in the negotiations is that in effect business is split, which is not something that we've seen in other spaces. Business is split between plastic product producers, the people who make the plastic itself, and the brands. So if you go to Coca-Cola, if you go to Ford Motor Company, if you go to all these, they know, because they have done the research, they know that the consumer's opinion on this is changing fundamentally. They know that an unregulated future is for them a more difficult one. So you will find a very strong business coalition actually on this negotiation by many of the world's biggest companies, all of whom are in favor of a regulated future with respect to plastic production and trade, because it is the only way in which they see themselves able to continue to make products and so on. So they prefer, and this is a relatively interesting phenomenon to watch, they prefer to have a regulated future than to have an unregulated future, which is what the oil producers and plastic makers would prefer in that case. So you find those two, the business world split and at odds with itself in some respects along some fault lines. So that's an interesting one. The polluter pays principle, again, very interesting to watch. I don't know enough about it. I wish I knew a lot more about it. It's used in other spaces. And I think you have certain systems that exist for certain chemicals, certain products. It's not wide. I should, if anybody here is an expert on polluter pays, please stand up at EPR schemes. There's a lot of experimentation going on, is my impression. And the ideal and the principle is clear. How you apply it briefly, for example, this has just happened in California about 1.5 years ago. They created an EPR system for plastics, saying that basically plastics producers, primary plastics and plastics product makers, actually had to figure out amongst themselves how to raise, I think it was $500 million or something like that, to begin to pay for recycling for communities. And it is a system where you basically allocate responsibility to the producer and say, listen, either you figure it out, you raise enough money and you solve this problem to our satisfaction, or we're coming in. and they usually prefer to do it themselves. And it runs the gamut from the money that's required down to the environmental specifications and the exact operations that they're going to run, all of which are subject to public scrutiny. And that's a very interesting system if you can work it out in one area after another. I believe, I shouldn't have spoken too quickly, I don't think it existed in 1948. And it is one of the consequences of the sort of the materialist culture that we have been carrying on with for the last 30, 40 years, that now we've come around to this principle in modern indigenous groups, and those who sort of familiar with indigenous knowledge would tell you that principle has existed for a much longer period of time in established societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being a wonderful audience, but let's all thank our speaker who brought at least 4 worlds together and did so with a policy lens, an economic lens, a global lens, and a legal lens. Thank you so much. Thank you.